Hello everyone. This is Sova TV.
Today's video is not directly related to Korea. Nevertheless, the reason why we prepared this video is to let you know that the contents that will be dealt with are serious and that if we develop into the worst situation, it will affect not only Korea but also the world. The military confrontation between the United States and China in the South China Sea is getting worse over time. Countries in Indonesia, Malaysia, Brunei, Vietnam, Philippines are also keeping an eye on what's happening in the South China Sea, and tensions are growing. In 2020, the United States has been strengthening its anti-China front by strengthening military exercises in the South China Sea, insisting on freedom of navigation. As a result, the possibility of a local military clash with China has increased. The U.S. action stems from its position that it will never accept China's control of the South China Sea. We also see it as Trump's strategy to bring about a complete victory in the trade war with China. The United States recently conducted an exercise in Guam, an artificial island occupation by China. The exercise was to assume and occupy the Andersen Air Force Base. It was the first time for the U.S. military to conduct such a large-scale exercise in Guam. Forbes said, the U.S. military exercise in Guam is China's intention to occupy an artificial island. The U.S. military seems to be preparing an operation to occupy an artificial island base in the South China Sea in case of an armed conflict with China. The U.S. military sends 3 to 5 reconnaissance planes to the South China Sea every day, has deployed to aircraft carriers and other vessels, and frequently conducts free navigation operations. Strategic bombers and other fighter jets are on standby 24 hours a day. Threatened by U.S. military exercises, China even violated Indonesian territorial waters and provoked protests against U.S. military operations. The problem is that China is willing to strengthen cooperation with Indonesia to jointly maintain peace and stability in the South China Sea. Chinese Defense Minister Wei Feng said during a series of visits to 4 Asian countries, including Malaysia, Brunei, and the Philippines, from September 7 to 11. China's invasion of Indonesian territorial waters shortly after China's efforts to stabilize the South China Sea is a violation of China's urgency. The South China Sea is geographically important because if China takes control of the South China Sea, the U.S. is likely to lose control of the South China Sea, and its influence on East Asia, including Southeast Asia, could be weakened. Besides, allowing China to ignore international law could neutralize the existing U.S.-led order. The U.S. government's freedom of navigation operation against China is also aimed at keeping China in check. The U.S. has also pursued an India-Pacific strategy along with Japan, Australia, and India, judging that free navigation alone cannot deter the Chinese government's ambitions. Also, the United States is actively working with ASEAN members, including Vietnam, Indonesia, Singapore, and the Philippines, to strengthen its Indo-Pacific strategy. In particular, the U.S. is strongly opposed to the fact that the Corona-19 originates from China, and it also says it can engage in an armed confrontation with China. U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said in a statement on July 13 that it is illegal by international law for China to unilaterally claim rights to territorial waters and marine resources in the South China Sea. The world will not allow China to treat the South China Sea as its maritime empire, he said. The United States has decided not to recognize China's maritime rights other than 12 nautical miles on China-controlled islands in the South China Sea. The U.S. is likely to intervene militarily in future territorial disputes in the South China Sea. It is important in that the U.S. government is quietly laying the legal ground for the use of military power against China in the South China Sea, Washington said. As a result, there are even scenarios of U.S. military action in the South China Sea. The first target of the U.S. surprise attack is likely to be Scarborough, where Chinese troops are not currently stationed. The U.S. is pushing to use strategic bombers to blow up Scarborough and stop China from claiming sovereignty over the reef. Another scenario is that the U.S. will first demand China withdraw its troops from the South China Sea and dismantle its military facilities, and if China does not accept it, it will take over the PD Cross Reefs and Misty Atolls to destroy missile launchers. Hong Kong magazine Asia News also predicts that the U.S. could strike artificial islands with military bases. We cannot ignore the possibility of the United States using force in the South China Sea before the November 3 presidential election, said Hua Yong, head of the Center for American Studies at Beijing University. China, which is well aware of the U.S. intentions, has sent Secretary of Defense Wei Feng Secretary of Defense Wei Fenghe made a series of visits to the 4 ASEAN countries and urged, "Let's resolve the South China Sea issue through negotiations between countries in the region." There is a reason why China is obsessed with the South China Sea. This is because the South China Sea is a passageway for all kinds of raw materials and export ships to Korea and Japan as well as China. It's an important place where huge trade volumes of $3 trillion pass through each year. In Korea, 30% of exports and 90% of imported energy pass through the South China Sea. China, in particular, is a lifeline for maritime transportation in the South China Sea. China, the world's second-largest economy, has to secure a channel for energy, raw materials, and goods that is vital to the nation. If the South China Sea is blocked, China will have no choice but to give in without a proper fight. The South China Sea is also a repository of resources. The South China Sea has considerable natural resources. It is estimated that 213 billion barrels of oil and 3.8 trillion square meters of natural gas are buried. And there is also a large amount of gas hydrate called burning ice. For a long time, China has turned reefs and coral reefs into artificial islands and already turned them into military bases. It acts as an aircraft carrier that doesn't collapse. Artificial islands can function as aircraft carriers, so they can not only respond quickly to armed conflicts but also launch fighter jets if they declare an air defense identification zone. There are 7 artificial islands created by China, and among them, Mischief et al., Petey Cross et al., and Subi et al. Have already completed military bases. Indonesia, which China mentioned this time, has also been engaged in a war of nerves with China over fishing rights in waters around the Natuna Islands in the South China Sea since 2016. Indonesia has named the waters of the Natuna Islands in the South China Sea, North Natuna Sea, and published a new map, which will be used to protect its warships by the fishing and development activities of its people. It is clear that the South China Sea will become a major region and powder keg for the United States, ASEAN member states, and China. This is the position of each country. An Indonesian official said, "We dispatched an Indian Navy warship to the South China Sea shortly after the border clash. This is a measure intended to affect the status of the Chinese Navy and its security establishment." The Philippines also once argued that the U.S. should join China's sanctions against its military base in the South China Sea. And Vietnam pointed out China's South China Sea drills as infringing Vietnam's sovereignty and not helping peace, stability, cooperation in the South China Sea. Japan also sided with Secretary of Defense Kono Taro in a meeting with U.S. Defense Secretary Mark Esper, saying, "We need to deepen cooperation as a country with the same idea as the U.S." China has repeatedly warned that U.S. intervention is the root of the South China Sea problem, and that it is only in line with U.S. interests and global ambitions, and that countries in the region will pay for it. The military confrontation between the two countries in the South China Sea is likely to become even more serious as China's move to secure its routes under Trump's trade sanctions, coupled with an external strategy to overcome the prospect of Trump's re-election to the U.S. presidential election on November 3rd. If the military conflict between the U.S. and China begins, the Japanese government will revise its constitution and begin military operations immediately to strengthening its shaky political support. This is most worrisome for the neighboring country, South Korea, and beyond the new diplomatic problems of East Asia. It will become a volatile region where the possibility of a new military conflict is rising. That's all for today's video. Thanks for watching it.
If you are curious about the next video, press the button, subscribe, like, and alarm buttons. From COVID-19, always be careful for the safety of you, your family, and your neighbors.